A howling night. The wind howled like a hungry wolf across Farmer McGregor's fields, a relentless, icy shriek that rattled the ancient panes of the farmhouse and tore at the skeletal branches of the old oak by the porch. It whipped snow into stinging flurries, sculpting drifts against the barn doors and painting the world in stark, frozen white. Inside, the timbers of the house groaned in protest, a symphony of creaks and moans that spoke of age and endurance. Barnaby, a shaggy sheepdog with kind, intelligent eyes that were usually crinkled with good humour, was not, on this particular night, nestled on his customary worn rug by the kitchen fire. His thick, wiry coat, usually a comforting warmth against the chill, felt inadequate tonight. He was in the barn, a place he frequented during the day, but rarely after the last milking. Tonight, however, felt different. A prickle of unease had settled under his fur hours ago, and no amount of hearthside warmth could dislodge it. He paced the central aisle of the barn, his claws clicking softly on the rough-hewn floorboards. The familiar sense of hay, warm animal bodies, and faint manure usually lulled him into a peaceful state. But tonight, a new, subtle aroma mingled with the others. Something sharp, metallic, and tinged with a delicate, almost imperceptible sweetness. It wasn't a smell of distress exactly, but of something teetering on the edge. He stopped before a stall where old Bess, a Guernsey cow with a placid disposition and a belly swollen with her impending calf, usually rested. Tonight, Bess was on her side, breathing heavily, her eyes wide and a sheen of sweat on her flanks. Barnaby whined softly, a low rumble in his chest. He nudged her muzzle with his wet nose, a gentle inquiry. Bess responded with a weak moo, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Barnaby's ears swivelled, processing the subtle changes in her usual breathing pattern. This wasn't just labour. Something felt wrong for the night. The storm had pushed his usual chores later, and the wind's incessant wail was already wearing on his nerves. He stirred the embers in the hearth, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "Barnaby, you coming in?" he called, his voice a gravelly rumble. He expected the familiar thud of paws on the porch, followed by the dog shaking off the last of the cold before collapsing onto his rug. But no thud came, only the relentless shriek of the wind. McGregor frowned, pulling his pipe from his mouth. Barnaby was devoted to his rug. "Stubborn old beast," he muttered, thinking the dog was simply enjoying the unusual freedom of a late-night prowl in the yard. He gave it a minute, then another. Still nothing. "All right, stay out then. You'll freeze your tail off," he grumbled, though a flicker of concern started to gnaw at him. Barnaby, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated. He barked, a sharp, insistent sound that echoed in the cavernous barn. Bess shifted, a low groan escaping her. The smell was stronger now, tinged with a new, raw earthiness. Barnaby barked again, a series of urgent yelps, then trotted to the barn door. He pushed his head against the latch, whining, then looked back at Bess. He barked once more, a desperate plea, before turning and scratching at the door, hoping to attract attention. Back in the farmhouse, McGregor sighed. That was an unusual bark. Not the playful, let's chase a rabbit bark, nor the stranger at the gate bark. This was different. "Know what's got into him," he muttered, pushing himself out of his armchair. He pulled on his heavy coat and hat, grabbing a lantern. A dark, shaggy shape materialized from the dark, shaggy shape. Dark, shaggy shape materialized from the dark, shaggy shape. 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 Materialized from the swirling snow bounding towards him. Barnaby didn't greet him with his usual joyful leaps. Instead, he barked once, sharply, then turned and ran a few paces towards the barn, looking back at McGregor, then back at the barn. He barked again, a short, sharp yelp, then repeated the movement, a clear invitation. McGregor squinted through the swirling snow. "What in tarnation are you doing, you daft animal? Get in here!" he shouted, exasperated. Barnaby ignored him, repeating the frantic dash-and-look-back routine. A tremor of unease finally pricked McGregor. Barnaby wasn't a fool. He knew the routine. This behaviour was completely out of character. All right, I'm comin', you mad dog," he grumbled, though his pace quickened. He followed Barnaby's lead, battling the wind as he stumbled towards the barn. Barnaby pushed against the heavy barn door, whining, his tail thumping against the wood. McGregor wrestled the frozen latch open, and the dog shot inside, immediately trotting towards Bess's stall, looking over his shoulder to ensure the farmer was following. Inside, the dim light of McGregor's lantern cast dancing shadows. He saw Bess, still on her side, trembling. The air was thick with the strange, coppery scent. Then he saw it. A small, dark hoof, barely visible, protruding at an unnatural angle. Bess was in trouble. The calf was stuck. McGregor dropped to his knees, his gruffness melting away into urgent concern. He assessed the situation quickly, his years of experience kicking in. "Oh, Bess, you poor thing," he murmured, his voice soft with worry. Barnaby stood beside him, watching with intense concentration, occasionally nudging McGregor's hand with his head, a silent encouragement. The next hour was a blur of strenuous effort. McGregor worked with practiced hands, carefully, gently, coaxing the calf. Bess moaned, and Barnaby whined in sympathy, his head resting against her flank. The struggle was immense, the tension palpable in the cold, dim barn. McGregor grunted, strained, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. Finally, with a soft squelch and a rush of fluid, the calf slid free. It was small, wet, and motionless. McGregor quickly cleared its nostrils, rubbing its tiny chest. Barnaby nudged the calf, then licked its cold, wet fur. A moment of agonizing silence stretched. Then, a weak, reedy cough. Another. And then, a small, tentative breath, followed by a shaky, bleating cry. McGregor slumped back against the stall wall, breathing heavily, a triumphant, exhausted grin spreading across his face. "You did it, Bess. You did it, little one." He looked at Barnaby, whose tail was now wagging a slow, content rhythm. "And you, old boy," he said, reaching out to ruffle the dog's shaggy head. "You saved him." The wind still howled outside, but inside the barn, a fragile warmth had taken root. McGregor helped the exhausted Bess to her feet, guiding the shivering calf to its mother's side. He watched as the tiny creature, still slick with birth, nuzzled blindly for nourishment. The next morning, the storm had abated, leaving behind a world sparkling under a fresh blanket of snow. Farmer McGregor returned to the barn, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. He found Barnaby, not on his kitchen rug, but curled up tightly in the straw, directly in front of Bess's stall. His eyes were closed, but one ear twitched, ever vigilant. Next to him, nestled against Bess's warm flank, was the wobbly new calf, already gaining strength, safe under the watchful gaze of its shaggy, loyal protector. Barnaby's vigil. The blizzard, its fury spent, still cloaked the world in an ethereal white. Snow piled against the barn, crafting drifts that menaced the lower windows. Inside, A lone lantern cast mercurial shadows, dancing over the weary but content faces of Farmer McGregor and his loyal sheepdog Barnaby. Bess, the new mother, tenderly nudged her wobbly calf, a miniature miracle with soft, dark fur. McGregor, satisfied that the calf had nursed and Bess was settled, stretched his protesting back. "Well, old boy," he grunted, ruffling Barnaby's shaggy head, "you more than earned your supper tonight." Barnaby responded with a soft exhalation. His eyes, usually alight with mischief, now held a deep, quiet reverence as he watched the newborn. The air in the barn was a rich tapestry of hay, damp earth, and the sweet scent of new life. After a moment, McGregor retrieved his coat and hat from a nearby peg. "Time for a cuppa, I reckon."
"Coming, Barnaby."
The sheepdog blinked slowly, then resettled his chin onto his paws, his gaze unwavering on the calf. A low rumble emanated from his chest, a vibration of profound contentment rather than a growl. McGregor paused, a furrow creasing his brow. "Barnaby, don't be daft, you'll freeze." The dog merely shifted, his tail delivering a single, almost imperceptible thump against the straw. He looked from the calf to McGregor, then back, a silent communion passing between them. McGregor, weary as he was, recognised the familiar resolve in Barnaby's posture. He'd witnessed it countless times, guarding a particular sheep, or standing sentinel over a fallen branch that might conceal a squirrel's hoard. "All right, have it your way," McGregor muttered, pulling the barn door open just enough to squeeze through. A sudden gust whipped snowflakes inside, making the lantern's flame dance wildly. He glanced back, half expecting Barnaby to follow, but the dog remained steadfast, a furry guardian. McGregor sighed, pulling the door shut with a solid thud, the latch clicking into place. Inside his snug farmhouse, the hearth fire had dwindled to glowing embers. He coaxed it back to life, the crackle and pop a comforting counterpoint to the wind's mournful howl. Brewing a strong cup of tea, the steam warmed his chapped hands. His thoughts drifted to the barn, to Bess, her calf, and to Barnaby. A faint smile touched his lips. The dog truly was extraordinary. Always had been. After finishing his tea, McGregor felt exhaustion truly claim him. He stood, intending to head to bed. Passing the window, he paused. Moonlight, now piercing the dissipating clouds, cast an ethereal sheen on the snow-covered yard. There, a dark, unmoving shape. Barnaby. The dog sat by the barn door, his tail thumping softly, a rhythmic pulse against the packed snow. He was hunched, head low, eyes fixed on the faint light filtering from the barn's tiny window. Large, perfect snowflakes settled on his shaggy coat, melting into dark spots that quickly solidified into tiny beads of ice. A shiver ran through him, but it wasn't from the cold. A faint, almost imperceptible whimper escaped him. McGregor frowned. This was uncharacteristic. Barnaby always sought the warmth of the hearth after a night in the barn, especially one so eventful. McGregor unlatched the back door, the rush of frigid air making him clutch his cardigan tighter. "Barnaby, what in blazes are you doing out here? You'll become an icicle." Barnaby's head lifted, his ears swivelling towards the sound of McGregor's voice. He let out another soft whimper, tinged with what sounded like distress. He didn't move from his spot, but his tail thumped with a touch more urgency, stirring powdery snow. "Come on, boy, inside, now," McGregor insisted, his voice laced with concern. He began to approach, intending to shepherd the dog indoors. As McGregor neared, Barnaby rose, shaking a flurry of snow from his thick coat. He took 2 steps towards McGregor, then stopped, glancing back at the barn door. He emitted a low bark, less a greeting and more a plea. He looked at McGregor, then back at the barn, then back at McGregor, his eyes wide and earnest in the moonlight. McGregor stopped, a prickle of unease tracing his spine. Barnaby rarely defied a direct command, particularly regarding his own comfort. And that look in his eyes. It wasn't stubbornness. It was something else entirely. A silent, urgent message. He was trying to convey something, and whatever it was, it remained within the barn. A farmer's assumption. McGregor's breath plumed in the frigid air as he surveyed the snow-dusted landscape. The last stars were fading, yielding to a bruised purple horizon. He'd barely slept, the birthing process having kept him awake for most of the night, but a quiet sense of accomplishment warmed him more effectively than his thick woolen jacket. The new calf, a sturdy little thing with wide, inquisitive eyes, was nestled safely beside its mother. And Barnaby, faithful Barnaby, was curled protectively at the edge of their stall, a sentinel in fur. The farmer sighed, a weary but contented sound. He ran a gloved hand over the sheepdog's head. "Good boy, Barnaby. Best guardian a man could ask for." Barnaby's tail gave a single, slow thump against the straw. His amber eyes, usually so bright with canine eagerness, were heavy-lidded, reflecting the shared sleepless night. McGregor interpreted this as the exhaustion of a job well done. The dog had been diligent, unwavering, a furry shadow during the whole ordeal. As McGregor moved towards the milking shed, Barnaby uncurled himself with a stretch and followed, his usual spring missing from his step. McGregor opened the heavy barn door, letting in a gust of crisp air that carried the scent of pine and thawing snow. He expected Barnaby to head back inside, perhaps find a warm corner for a well-deserved nap. Instead, the dog stopped at the threshold, turned, and nudged the door with his wet nose, a low grumble vibrating in his chest. "What is it, boy? You want back in already?" McGregor chuckled, assuming the dog simply craved the warmth of the livestock. He gave the door a slight push, inviting Barnaby back into the barn's deeper recesses. But Barnaby didn't budge. He let out a short, insistent bark, then turned his head, looking back towards the row of stalls where the sheep and cows were just beginning to stir. McGregor paused, his brow furrowing slightly. Barnaby's behaviour was uncharacteristic. Usually, after a successful calving, Barnaby would be keen to return to the farmhouse for breakfast, a well-earned reward of scraps and affection. Yet here he stood, rooted to the spot, a stubborn, furry anchor. "Come on, Barnaby," McGregor urged, his voice edged with a touch of impatience. He was tired, and the day's chores were piling up. He needed to get the milk sorted, check the fences for snow damage, and then, perhaps, grab a few hours of sleep himself. "There's nothing else happening in there. The calf's safe, The ewes are fine." Barnaby let out another, sharper bark, his tail giving a quick, agitated flick. He took a few steps away from the barn, then looked back at McGregor, then back at the dark interior of the barn. It was a clear invitation, a silent plea. But McGregor, his mind clouded by fatigue and the lingering satisfaction of the successful birth, misinterpreted the urgency. He sighed, running a hand over his rough chin. All right, you worrywart. Just checking." He walked a few steps into the barn, peering into the dim stalls. The cows were chewing their cud placidly. The ewes were huddled together, their lambs bleating softly. The new calf was suckling vigorously, its mother licking its damp coat. Everything appeared to be in order. "See? All quiet," McGregor stated, turning back towards Barnaby, who remained stubbornly outside. "You're just being an overly diligent guardian, aren't you? Can't switch off the old instincts." He gave a reassuring pat to the dog's head, feeling the coarse fur beneath his palm. Barnaby nuzzled his hand briefly, but his eyes, when they met McGregor's, still held that persistent, unyielding intensity. McGregor, however, was already turning away, his thoughts drifting to the steaming mug of coffee waiting for him in the farmhouse. He assumed Barnaby, satisfied that his human had conducted a final inspection, would eventually follow. He closed the barn door with a definitive thud, the sound echoing through the pre-dawn quiet. He walked towards the farmhouse, the crunchy snow under his boots the only sound in the stillness. He didn't look back, not seeing Barnaby, still standing by the barn door, letting out a low, mournful whine that was quickly swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the winter morning. The dog remained, resolute, a lone sentinel, his distress growing with every passing moment. The urgent bark. The digital glow of the alarm clock painted the bedside table in stark relief. 2:17 a.m. McGregor stirred, a low groan rumbling in his chest. His body, usually a reliable engine, felt like a collection of frayed wires after the night's exertions. He'd barely plunged into the deep, dreamless sleep his weary bones craved when a sound, sharp and insistent, lanced through the farmhouse's quiet. It wasn't the usual rhythmic baying of a distant hound, nor the rustle of wind in the eaves. This was a single, explosive burst of sound, a primal summons that vibrated through the very floorboards. Barnaby. McGregor blinked, trying to clear the lingering fog of sleep. He sat up, the springs of the old mattress groaning in protest. The air in the room was cold, a testament to the deepening hours of the night. He listened, straining his ears against the retreating echoes of the bark. Silence, heavy and complete, descended once more. He sighed, a tired breath that plumed visibly in the frigid air. Just an old dog, he thought, probably chasing a phantom squirrel in his dreams. He flopped back onto the pillow, pulling the thick quilt higher, willing sleep to reclaim him. But sleep, it seemed, had taken its leave. Just as his eyelids began to droop, another bark shattered the stillness. This one was closer, imbued with a frantic edge that prickled the hairs on his arms. It wasn't a playful yap, nor a territorial warning. This was a cry of urgency, a desperate plea. McGregor swung his legs out of bed, the cold floor biting at his bare feet. He fumbled for his worn dressing gown, shrugging it on as he padded towards the window. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the frost-kissed fields. He squinted, trying to pierce the gloom. Nothing. The barn stood as a dark, monolithic shape against the lighter horizon, silent and unmoving. Then, a rapid volley of barks erupted, each one higher-pitched, more frantic than the last. There was no mistaking the raw distress in Barnaby's voice now. It was a sound McGregor hadn't heard from his usually stoic companion in years, not since a fox had once threatened a new litter of piglets. This wasn't merely a dog being over-diligent. This was a dog in full-blown alarm. A knot of unease began to tighten in McGregor's stomach. He moved swiftly, grabbing his thick wool jacket from the peg by the door. As he pulled on his boots, another series of sharp, yelping barks reached him. Closer still. It sounded as if Barnaby was right outside the farmhouse door, his voice hoarse with exertion. McGregor unlatched the heavy wooden door, a blast of icy air hitting him squarely in the face. Barnaby stood on the porch, a dark silhouette against the pale gleam of the snow. His ears were flattened, his tail tucked low, and his whole body trembled with an almost manic energy. He wasn't barking at McGregor, but past him, towards the barn. He let out a piercing whine, then turned his head, fixing his amber eyes on McGregor with an intensity that brooked no argument. He nudged McGregor's hand with his wet nose, a soft, insistent pressure, before darting a few paces towards the barn, then stopping, looking back, as if urging him to follow. "Barnaby, what in tarnation?" McGregor mumbled, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold seeping into his bones. This was beyond unusual. Barnaby, for all his loyalty, knew the boundaries of the night. He knew when his work was done. Took another step towards the barn. Then took another step towards the barn. Then another, his gaze fixed on McGregor, waiting. The farmer hesitated, a battle waging between his desire for sleep and the growing dread in his gut. He looked at the dog, whose usually bright eyes were now clouded with an almost human anxiety. He thought of the new calf, nestled in the straw, and the cow, still recovering. He thought of the strange, persistent feeling he'd shaken off hours earlier. With a heavy sigh that fogged in the moonlight, McGregor pulled his jacket tighter. "All right, boy," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. "All right. Lead the way." Barnaby's tail gave a single, tentative thump against the frozen ground. He let out a low, soft bark, almost a whimper of relief, before turning and trotting purposefully towards the dark, looming shape of the barn, his shadow stretching long and distorted behind him in the pale moonlight. McGregor followed, his boots crunching on the frozen earth, the silence of the night now feeling less peaceful and more like a held breath. A midnight visitor. The persistent scratching at the back door, coupled with a series of sharp, almost frantic barks, finally yanked Farmer McGregor from the warm embrace of his armchair. He'd just settled in after a long day, a mug of steaming chamomile tea clutched in his hand, feeling the satisfying ache of honest labour in his bones. The successful carving earlier that evening had left him content, a rare feeling of peace washing over him. Now, that peace was shattered. "Barnaby, "What in the blazes?" he grumbled, pushing himself up, the old floorboards creaking a protest. He shuffled to the door, expecting to see the sheepdog merely agitated by a stray rabbit or the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. But this was different. The barks were not the usual playful or territorial alerts. They held an edge of desperation, a guttural plea that sent a ripple of unease down McGregor's spine. He pulled open the heavy oak door, and Barnaby was there, a dark, shaggy silhouette against the dim glow of the yard light. The dog's tail, usually a steady pendulum of contentment, was thrashing wildly, a blur of motion. Before McGregor could utter another word, Barnaby nudged his hand with a cold, wet nose, a sharp, insistent push. Then he let out another series of high-pitched barks, not at the night itself, but pointedly at McGregor, as if trying to convey an urgent message. His eyes, usually warm and intelligent, were wide with a frantic intensity that McGregor had only seen a handful of times before, each instance preceding a significant farm crisis. All right, I hear you, boy," McGregor said, though his voice lacked its usual dismissive tone. He recognized the look in Barnaby's eyes, the uncharacteristic urgency in his every movement. This wasn't a squirrel in the pantry. This was something serious. He reached out to pat Barnaby's head, but the dog merely ducked away, letting out a frustrated whine, then spun around, taking a few steps towards the barn before looking back expectantly. McGregor sighed, a deep exhalation that fogged in the cool night air. The tea was forgotten, growing cold on the table. He pulled on his boots, the familiar worn leather a comfort, and grabbed his heavy canvas jacket from the hook by the door. The night air bit at his exposed skin, a crisp chill that promised a touch of frost by morning. Barnaby, meanwhile, danced an impatient jig by the porch steps, his whole body quivering with an almost palpable anxiety. "What is it, Barnaby? Another fox?" McGregor muttered, though he knew it wasn't. Barnaby's fox warnings were sharp, clipped barks, not this drawn-out, almost pleading chorus. As McGregor stepped off the porch, Barnaby immediately began to trot purposefully towards the barn, occasionally glancing back to ensure the farmer was following. His gait was different too. Not the usual tireless lope, but a series of quick, darting movements, as if he were trying to outrun an invisible threat. The path to the barn was a familiar one, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, human and animal. Tonight, however, it felt different. The shadows cast by the moon on the old oak trees seemed deeper, more menacing. The hoot of an owl, usually a comforting sound, now seemed eerie, a harbinger of something amiss. Barnaby continued his urgent lead, never straying from the path, his focus unwavering. He was a canine compass, pulling McGregor towards an unknown destination within the familiar confines of his own farm. McGregor's initial weariness had been replaced by a growing sense of apprehension. Barnaby had never been wrong, not once. Every frantic bark, every insistent nudge had always led to a situation requiring immediate attention, from a broken fence to a lamb separated from its mother. The memory of the difficult carving earlier that evening, and Barnaby's steadfast presence throughout, flickered in his mind. The thought of something else going wrong so soon after filled him with dread. What could be so urgent, so dire, that it would drag his loyal guardian from his warm bed on such a cold night? As they neared the barn, a faint sound carried on the wind, a low, distressed bleating, barely audible over the rustle of dry leaves. It was faint, almost swallowed by the night, but to McGregor it was as clear as a bell. His pace quickened, his heart beginning to pound a little harder in his chest. Barnaby, sensing the farmer's increased urgency, let out a final, short bark, then plunged through the open barn door, disappearing into the cavernous darkness within. McGregor followed, his hand already reaching for the light switch, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The tea, the warmth, the contentment, all were distant memories now, replaced by the chilling certainty that Barnaby had, once again, found something needing his farmer's immediate attention. Misunderstood intentions. The persistent scratching at the door escalated into a frantic scrabbling, punctuated by sharp, desperate barks. McGregor, snug beneath his patchwork quilt, pulled the blanket higher, a low groan rumbling in his chest. "Barnaby, for heaven's sake," he mumbled into his pillow. "It's the middle of the night." He just drifted off again, lulled by the gentle rhythm of the rain against the window pane, when the commotion began anew. The dog wasn't just barking. It sounded like a small, furry battering ram was trying to dismantle his front door. A sigh escaped McGregor's lips, heavy with resignation. This was becoming a habit. He swung his legs out of bed, the cool wooden floor a stark contrast to his warm sheets. He fumbled for the lamp, its sudden glow casting long, dancing shadows across the room. He squinted, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Barnaby, he decided, was either suffering from an acute case of midnight munchies or had developed an uncanny knack for knowing precisely when McGregor was at his most comfortable. He shuffled towards the door, his movements sluggish and reluctant. The insistent scratching continued, accompanied by short, sharp yelps. All right, I'm coming, you impatient hound," he grumbled, fumbling with the latch. The moment the door creaked open, a furry black and white blur shot past his legs, nearly tripping him. Barnaby didn't stop to greet him, didn't even glance back. He was already halfway down the porch steps, barking excitedly, then turning to look at McGregor with an intensity that bordered on manic. McGregor stood in the doorway, the cool night air raising goosebumps on his arms. The rain had softened to a fine drizzle, but a brisk wind rustled through the bare branches of the oak tree by the barn. Barnaby, silhouetted against the dim glow of the rising moon, let out another series of urgent barks, a low whine threading through them. He then took a few steps towards the barn, paused, and looked back at McGregor, as if willing him to follow. "What is it, boy?" McGregor muttered, his voice still thick with sleep. He shivered, pulling his worn flannel robe tighter around him. "You want a biscuit? Is that it? Did you forget where I put the jar?" He began to walk towards the kitchen, fully intending to grab a handful of dog treats. He could hear Barnaby's frantic barks intensify, his paws thudding on the damp earth as he ran back and forth between the barn and the house. McGregor paused, one hand on the cool metal of the biscuit tin. Barnaby was now practically doing a jig on the porch, a high-pitched, almost desperate whimper escaping him. It wasn't the usual "feed me" bark. This had a different timbre, a frantic undertone that even McGregor, in his groggy state, couldn't entirely ignore. "You're really making a fuss, aren't you?" he mumbled, more to himself than to the dog. He glanced out the window towards the barn, a dark, hulking shape against the bruised sky. Nothing seemed amiss. No unusual lights, no strange sounds, just the quiet hum of the night. Still, Barnaby's relentless insistence gnawed at the edges of his irritation. It wasn't a squirrel, not at this hour. And Barnaby usually reserved this level of hysteria for something truly extraordinary. He let out another sigh, this one more of exasperation than resignation. "Fine," he conceded, the word feeling heavy in the still air. "But if this is about a mouse you cornered, you're sleeping in the barn tonight." He pulled on his sturdy, mud-splattered boots, the effort feeling monumental. Each lace felt like a challenge, each eyelet a tiny battle. The thought of venturing out into the damp, chilly night for what was likely a canine caprice was not appealing. As he pulled on his old chore coat, its familiar scent of hay and damp earth a comfort, Barnaby was already back at the porch steps, pawing at the lowest one, his tail a frantic blur. His eyes, even in the dim light, seemed to plead, to demand attention. The urgency in his posture, the low, guttural growls that punctuated his barks, were almost enough to convince McGregor that something genuinely was wrong. Almost. But his mind, still half asleep, stubbornly clung to the simpler explanation. Barnaby, for all his intelligence, was still a dog. And dogs, in McGregor's experience, often equated frantic energy with the promise of food. He stepped out onto the porch, the worn wood groaning under his weight. Barnaby immediately darted forward, then stopped, looking back expectantly. He took a few steps towards the barn, then turned again, letting out a sharp, piercing bark that seemed to echo in the quiet night. McGregor shuffled after him, his flashlight beam cutting a wobbly path through the drizzle. "All right, Barnaby, lead the way," he grumbled, his voice laced with annoyance. "But if this is just you trying to get me to share my biscuits, you've got another thing coming." His boots squelched softly on the damp ground as he followed the determined sheepdog, the bleating sound that had startled Barnaby now faintly reaching McGregor's ears, still too soft to register as anything other than the usual night sounds of the farm. A reluctant journey. McGregor, grumbling under his breath about restless nights and overly dramatic dogs, wrestled his feet into worn boots. The chill from the floorboards had already seeped into his bones, a stark contrast to the cocoon of warmth he'd abandoned. Barnaby, a whirlwind of black and white fur, danced at his heels, a low, urgent whine rumbling in his chest. "See what all the fuss is about." He grabbed a flickering lantern from its hook by the door, its weak glow casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. As the latch clinked and the heavy oak door creaked open, a blast of icy air swept into the cosy farmhouse. Barnaby, as if released from an invisible leash, shot out into the moonless night. He didn't just run. He torpedoed across the yard, a white streak against the gloom, barking sharply over his shoulder, urging McGregor to follow. The farmer hesitated, pulling the door shut against the biting wind, a shiver tracing its way down his spine. The cold was more intense than he'd anticipated, a truly bitter late autumn night. The thought of his warm bed, still rumpled and inviting, was a siren song, but Barnaby's frantic barks were a louder, more insistent call. With a sigh that plumed in the frigid air, McGregor began his slow, deliberate walk across the frozen yard. The ground was hard beneath his boots, each step crunching on frosted grass. The wind, a mischievous entity, nipped at his exposed cheeks, painting them a raw, stinging red. He pulled his sweater tighter, hunching his shoulders against the onslaught. Above, the sky was a velvet expanse, pricked with countless indifferent stars. The farmhouse, with its single dim light in the kitchen window, seemed miles away, an unreachable haven. Barnaby had paused halfway to the barn, his tail a frantic blur, head cocked, watching McGregor's progress with an intensity that bordered on exasperation. When the farmer finally trudged past the silent, skeletal apple trees, the dog let out another volley of barks, then resumed his dash, disappearing into the cavernous darkness of the barn. "Patience, dog, patience," McGregor mumbled, though he knew Barnaby wouldn't understand. A raw edge to the dog's barks, a palpable anxiety that stirred a dormant worry within McGregor. He pushed open the heavy barn door, the hinges groaning in protest. The familiar smell of hay, dust, and livestock, usually comforting, felt strangely charged tonight. The lantern's beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dancing motes of dust and casting long, distorted shadows of the stalls. The cows shifted uneasily in their pens, their soft lowing a counterpoint to the relentless wind whistling through the gaps in the barn walls. Barnaby was already at the far end, not by the usual feed bins, nor by the sheep pens. He was at the last stall, the one where Bess, the old Jersey cow, was due to calve any day now. The dog was nose to nose with the wooden barrier, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest, punctuated by sharp, desperate yelps. He kept looking back at McGregor, his eyes wide and pleading, then nudging the wooden gate with his wet nose. McGregor approached cautiously, his brow furrowed. What could possibly be wrong with Bess? She was a seasoned mother, having birthed many calves without incident. As he drew closer, the air grew thick with a different scent. The coppery tang of blood, mixed with the musky aroma of birth. His heart began to pound a little faster. This wasn't a playful summons or a hunger pang. This was something serious. Barnaby's frantic energy was no longer an annoyance. It was a blaring alarm. The farmer felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, a feeling he knew all too well when life and death hung in the balance on his farm. The wind howled outside, mirroring the rising anxiety within the barn. The barn's secret. The heavy oak door groaned shut behind McGregor, cutting off the biting wind, but not the deep chill that had settled in his bones. Inside the barn, the air offered a touch more warmth, a rich tapestry woven from the earthy scent of straw, hay, and the undeniable aroma of livestock. Usually, the soft, rhythmic chewing of cows and the occasional snort of a horse composed a comforting nocturnal symphony. Tonight, however, an unsettling tremor vibrated beneath these familiar sounds. Barnaby, far from resting, was a taut wire of anxiety. His muffled barks, though dulled by the sturdy walls, carried an urgent, almost desperate plea. He streaked from the wide aisle, where McGregor now stood, to a particular stall at the far end, then back again, a black and white blur of frantic motion. All right, I'm here, you daft dog," McGregor grumbled, his voice hoarse, though a prickle of apprehension had begun to overshadow his initial annoyance. Barnaby ignored the words, continuing his frantic shuttle, his eyes darting from the stall to his master, a clear, insistent invitation to follow. The farmer's gaze swept over the rows of placid animals, their breath ghosting faintly in the dim glow of his single lantern. All appeared well. Horses dozed, tails swishing languidly. Goats, perched on their wooden platforms, observed with serene curiosity. Yet, Barnaby's relentless focus on one specific area was impossible to ignore. As McGregor took a hesitant step, Barnaby met him halfway, nudging vigorously at his leg with a wet nose, a low, guttural whine rumbling in his chest. It wasn't aggression, but a raw, unvarnished concern. Then the dog spun, fixing an unwavering stare on the large cow stall at the very end of the row. Bess's enclosure. From within came a low, drawn-out groan, unlike any contented moo. It was a sound laced with effort, with strain, and unmistakably with deep distress. McGregor's heart hitched. Bess. Barnaby, sensing the shift in his master's pace, the lantern swaying, its light carving dancing shadows across the straw-strewn floor. Barnaby, sensing the shift in his master's demeanour, bounded ahead, his barks no longer a general alarm, but sharp, pointed exhortations aimed squarely at Bess's stall. The intensity in his voice was palpable, a canine siren wailing for immediate attention. Reaching the sturdy wooden barrier of Bess's pen, McGregor peered over. The usually placid Jersey cow was not peacefully recumbent as she often was. She stood, her powerful body tensed, head lowered, flank heaving. Her eyes, typically soft and brown, were wide with a mixture of pain and fear. A dark, sticky patch stained the straw beneath her. The air around her seemed to thicken, heavy and saturated with a metallic tang McGregor now recognised with sickening certainty. Barnaby, balanced on his hind legs beside the farmer, emitted a series of short, sharp yelps, nose twitching, then nudged McGregor's arm with insistent pressure. His message was starkly clear. This was it. This was the crisis. This was what he had been trying to convey all along. The chill of the night outside suddenly felt insignificant compared to the cold dread now creeping through Farmer McGregor. Bessie's distress. The familiar scent of damp straw and animal warmth usually brought a comforting familiarity to Farmer McGregor's nose. Tonight, however, it was tinged with an acrid note of fear, a primal alarm that prickled at the back of his throat. Barnaby, still a whirlwind of black and white fur, darted ahead, his frantic barks echoing off the rough-hewn beams of the barn. He didn't just bark, he whined, a high-pitched, desperate plea that tore at McGregor's composure. All right, I'm coming," McGregor grumbled, his voice lacking its usual gruff authority. He pulled the lantern higher, its flickering light casting dancing shadows that seemed to magnify the tension in the air. Barnaby skidded to a halt in front of a particular stall, nudging the wooden door with his nose, then looking back at McGregor with wide, pleading eyes. The farmer approached, his boots thudding softly on the packed earth floor. As he drew closer, a low, guttural moan reached his ears, a sound of deep, profound suffering. It was Bessie, his usually placid Hereford, and the sound was entirely unlike her. McGregor peered into the dim stall, his breath catching in his throat. Bessie was down, not resting contentedly as cows often did, but stretched out, her massive body heaving with desperate effort. Her usually placid eyes were wide and bloodshot, rolling back in their sockets with each strained push. The telltale signs of carving. The mucus, the telltale signs of carving. The mucus and fluid staining the straw beneath her. But something was terribly wrong. The contractions were coming in rapid, agonizing waves, yet no calf was emerging. Then, as Bessie grunted with another Herculean effort, McGregor saw it. A tiny, wet hoof, no bigger than his thumb, poked out from beneath her tail, followed by another. They were positioned wrong, angled awkwardly, and the rest of the calf was clearly stuck. Bessie let out a piteous bellow, a sound that spoke volumes of her pain and frustration. Her head thrashed, her horns narrowly missing the stall wall. Barnaby, who had been watching McGregor intently, let out a sharp bark, then nudged the farmer's leg with his nose, as if urging him to act. The dog's anxiety was palpable, a coiled spring of worry vibrating beside McGregor. "Easy, boy, easy," McGregor said, his voice surprisingly calm despite the sudden surge of adrenaline. He knelt beside Bessie, his experienced hands moving instinctively to assess the situation. He could feel the resistance, the unnatural blockage. This wasn't a routine birth. This was a crisis. The calf was presenting with its forelegs back, a common but dangerous complication. He could see the terror in Bessie's eyes, the exhaustion wearing her down. She was fighting, but she was losing. The air in the stall grew heavy with the scent of blood and sweat, a stark reminder of the fragile line between life and death. He knew he had to act quickly. Every minute counted for both mother and calf. He patted Bessie's broad flank, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Hold on, girl. We'll get you through this." His mind raced, cataloguing the tools he'd need, the steps he'd have to take. This wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be pretty. But the sight of that struggling hoof, the immense effort of the mother, solidified his resolve. Barnaby sat back on his haunches, his gaze fixed on Bessie, then on McGregor. His frantic barks had subsided into a low, continuous whine, a sound of profound concern. He understood the gravity of the moment, the delicate balance of life that hung in the balance within the dimly lit stall. He was no longer just an alarm, he was a silent, vigilant witness, his presence a steady anchor in the churning storm of Bessie's struggle. McGregor, for the first time in a long time, felt a flicker of gratitude for the persistent, often annoying sheepdog. Barnaby hadn't just alerted him to a problem, he had led him to a desperate fight for life. And now, McGregor knew, the real work began. A race against time. The realization hit Farmer McGregor with the force of a physical blow. The calf wasn't merely presenting awkwardly, it was truly stuck. A dangerous, life-threatening jam that demanded immediate, skilled intervention. His heart, already thrumming from Barnaby's insistent barks and Bessie's pained grunts, now hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The air in the barn, thick with the scent of hay, fear, and animal musk, seemed to press in on him, amplifying the urgency of the moment. This wasn't a matter of waiting for nature to take its course. This was a race against time. He knelt beside Bessie, his calloused hand gently stroking her damp flank, a silent promise of help. Her eyes, wide and distressed, met his, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Barnaby, sensing the shift in McGregor's demeanour from annoyed exasperation to focused determination, settled onto his haunches a few feet away. His earlier frantic barks had subsided into low, guttural growls of concern, a constant, vibrating hum that underscored the gravity of the situation. He was no longer just an alarm. He was a steady, watchful anchor in the rising storm of the birthing stall. "All right, girl," McGregor murmured, his voice rougher than usual. He quickly rolled up the sleeves of his plaid shirt, exposing forearms corded with muscle from years of farm work. The cold barn air prickled his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was already cataloguing the steps, recalling lessons learned from his own father, from countless birthing books, from hard-won experience. He needed warmth, soap, ropes, and above all, a clear head. Panic wouldn't save Bessie or her calf. He rose swiftly, his movements economical and purposeful. "Barnaby, stay with her," he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. The dog merely shifted, eyes glued to Bessie, an unspoken agreement passing between them. McGregor strode towards the small supply shed, tucked into a corner of the barn, his boots crunching on stray bits of straw. Inside, he fumbled for the thick, sterile birthing ropes, the antiseptic soap, and a bucket. He filled the bucket from the tap, the cold water splashing over his hands, a brief, chilling jolt that sharpened his senses further. Returning to Bessie's side, he poured a generous amount of soap into the bucket, stirring it with his hand until suds formed. The metallic tang of the soap mingled with the barn's earthy scent. He then methodically scrubbed his hands and forearms, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. Every second counted, yet haste without preparation was folly. He could feel Barnaby's steady gaze on him, a silent pressure that urged him onward without breaking his concentration. The dog was a constant, living reminder of what was at stake. Bessie let out another low moan, her body trembling with the effort. McGregor knelt again, his gaze fixed on the small, visible part of the calf. He could see the struggle, the lack of progress, the danger. The calf's tongue was beginning to look purplish, a terrifying sign. There was no more time for hesitation, no room for doubt. He had to act, and he had to act now. "Easy, girl, easy," he whispered, his voice a low rumble of reassurance. He could feel the urgency pounding in his temples, a relentless drumbeat pushing him forward. He reached for the ropes, his fingers testing their strength, imagining their placement. The task ahead was delicate, requiring strength, precision, and an intuitive understanding of animal anatomy. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and he could lose them both. Barnaby let out a soft whine, then nudged McGregor's hand with his wet nose. The touch, unexpected, was a jolt of connection, a silent affirmation of their shared purpose. In that moment, the usual boundaries between man and dog, farmer and companion, blurred. They were a team, united by the desperate need to save a life. McGregor offered a quick, grateful glance to Barnaby, a silent acknowledgement of the dog's unwavering loyalty and his critical role in bringing this crisis to light. Without Barnaby, he might have found Bessie too late. The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine, quickly replaced by a surge of renewed resolve. He wouldn't let that happen. He would fight for Bessie and her calf with every ounce of his strength and skill. The battle had begun. The birth. Barnaby stood by, a sentinel of silent concern. His earlier frantic barks had subsided into soft, almost imperceptible whimpers, a low thrumming sound that vibrated in his chest. His eyes, usually bright with mischief or unwavering loyalty, were now pools of concentrated worry, fixed on McGregor's broad back as the farmer knelt beside Bessie. The air in the barn, thick with the earthy scent of straw and the metallic tang of blood, crackled with a palpable tension. Every strained grunt from Bessie, every heavy breath from McGregor seemed to echo Barnaby's own internal turmoil. He shifted his weight from paw to paw, a restless energy humming beneath his fur. But he stayed put, an anchor of quiet support in the storm of the birthing stall. McGregor, his face grimy with sweat and concentration, worked with a practiced intensity that belied the urgency of the situation. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle, now smeared with amniotic fluid. He talked to Bessie in low, soothing tones, even as he applied careful, deliberate pressure. "Easy, girl, easy now," he murmured, his voice gruff but reassuring. He felt for the calf's tiny, slick hooves, guiding them gently, trying to align the presentation that had gone so dangerously awry. It was a delicate dance between brute strength and precise tenderness, a battle against time and the unforgiving mechanics of nature. The farmer's brow was furrowed, a deep line etched between his eyes, but his movements were steady. He pulled, not with a sudden jerk, but with a sustained, even pressure, timing his efforts with Bessie's own contractions. He felt the resistance, the stubborn, unyielding lock of the calf within its mother, and for a fleeting moment, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through his resolve. But he pushed it away. There was no room for doubt now, only action. He repositioned his grip, his fingers expertly navigating the tight passage, feeling the delicate bones of the calf's legs. He knew, with an instinct honed by decades of farming, that one wrong move could be catastrophic. Barnaby, acutely sensitive to every shift in the atmosphere, picked up on McGregor's fleeting moment of uncertainty. A low growl, almost imperceptible, rumbled in his throat. It wasn't a threat, but a sound of deep concern, a quiet plea for the farmer to persevere. McGregor, though focused on Bessie, heard it. He glanced back, a quick, acknowledging nod to his dog, a silent affirmation of their shared burden. Barnaby's unwavering presence, his silent vigil, was a strange comfort, a steady heartbeat in the chaos. The struggle continued, a testament to Bessie's endurance and McGregor's unwavering determination. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of effort and the raw scent of life struggling to emerge. Bessie let out a deep, guttural moan, a sound of immense effort and pain. McGregor, seeing an opening, leaned in, bracing himself. "Now, Bessie, now!" he urged, his voice strained. He pulled, not just with his arms, but with the full force of his body, timing it perfectly with Bessie's final, monumental push. With a slithering, squelching sound, the calf began to emerge. First, the tiny hooves, then the slick, wet nose, followed by the broad forehead. McGregor continued to guide it, easing its passage. It lay there, a small, dark bundle. $1 million, million, $1 million, million. It lay there, a small, dark bundle, steaming slightly in the cool barn air. McGregor quickly cleared the mucus from its nose and mouth, his breath held tight in his chest. Bessie, exhausted but relieved, let out a soft, lowing sound, nudging her newborn with her head. Silence. The only sounds were Bessie's heavy breathing and the rustle of straw as McGregor leaned back, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. Barnaby crept closer, his head cocked, his sensitive ears straining. But there was no sound from the calf. No bleat, no struggling breath, only the unnerving quiet. The joy of the birth was instantly overshadowed by a chilling dread. McGregor's heart, which had just begun to lighten, plummeted. He reached out a hand, tentative, to touch the calf's flank. It was warm, but utterly, terrifyingly still. The sigh of relief poised on McGregor's lips caught, transforming into a gasp. The calf lay inert in the straw, a dark, damp mass against Bessie's exhausted flank. No twitch, no bleat, no shuddering breath signalled its arrival. The barn, moments before filled with Bessie's strenuous efforts and McGregor's grunts, now held an eerie, suffocating quiet. Barnaby, panting softly, stiffened. His ears, usually mobile and alert, flattened, and a low, almost inaudible whine vibrated in his chest. McGregor dropped to his knees, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. "No, not now," he rasped, dread thickening his voice. A trembling hand brushed aside the wet hair, clearing the last vestiges of membrane from the calf's nose. Stillness. The tiny chest remained stubbornly unmoving. A cold, sharp panic pricked at his composure. This grim tableau was familiar, a life extinguished before its flicker truly began. The ghost of past losses, like embedded splinters, threatened to overwhelm him. Barnaby nudged McGregor's arm with a wet nose, a soft, persistent plea. The farmer offered only a fleeting glance, his gaze riveted on the lifeless form. He snatched a rough burlap sack and began to rub the calf furiously, frantically chafing its minuscule chest, then its back, its legs, desperate to ignite a spark of vitality. The coarse fabric rasped against damp hide, a harsh, rhythmic sound slicing through the oppressive quiet. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Each sweep of the sack met the same terrifying inertia. Bessie, spent but acutely aware, rumbled a mournful protest. Barnaby's whine escalated into a keening lament, piercing the heavy air. His tail, a barometer of quiet anticipation, now hung limp. McGregor's breath hitched. A familiar knot of despair tightened in his gut. He was on the verge of surrender, of accepting the inevitable, when a faint, almost imperceptible tremor rippled through the calf's small body. He redoubled his efforts, renewed urgency fueling his desperate act. "Come on, little one," he pleaded, his voice a strained whisper. "Fight, damn it! Fight!" Then, a miracle. A weak, gurgling cough erupted, followed by a violent, gasping inhalation. The small form shuddered, and another breath, deeper this time, followed. Ragged, strained, but undeniably present. The calf's tiny head lifted infinitesimally, its still, unfocused eyes blinking against the dim light. McGregor exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief, potent and overwhelming, surged through him, banishing the cold dread. He slumped back on his heels, the burlap sack forgotten. His shoulders, previously hunched with tension, relaxed. A watery smile touched his lips. He glanced at Barnaby, whose entire body now quivered with a different kind of intensity, with anxiety now gleamed with a soft, warm light. A soft woof of pure contentment escaped him. With almost tender deliberation, Barnaby moved closer to the newborn. He lowered his head, his rough tongue extending, and gave the wobbly, still damp head a gentle, reassuring lick. A profound gesture of affection, a quiet welcome. The calf, stirred by the unexpected warmth, emitted a tiny, reedy bleat. McGregor watched, a lump forming in his throat. He saw not merely a dog and a calf, but a silent testament to life, to perseverance, and to the extraordinary, often unacknowledged, yet ever-present bond that wove through his farm. He reached out and ruffled Barnaby's fur, his hand lingering, a silent acknowledgement of the dog's unwavering presence and quiet support. The danger had passed. Life had prevailed. The hero's watch. The first hesitant streaks of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of bruised plum and soft rose. Within the barn, a profound quiet had settled, a stark contrast to the previous night's desperate struggle. McGregor, his limbs protesting from an uncomfortable night, slowly pushed himself from the hay-strewn floor. His back ached with the deep, satisfying soreness of honest labour. He stretched, joints popping like dry twigs. Then his still heavy eyelids lifted, seeking the small miracle he'd helped usher into the world. There, nestled close to the mother cow's warm flank, lay the calf. Its dappled brown and white fur seemed to shimmer in the nascent light filtering through the high windows. But his gaze didn't linger solely on the newborn. Curled protectively around the tiny creature, head resting gently on its still damp back, was Barnaby. The sheepdog slept soundly, his chest rising and falling in slow, rhythmic breaths. For hours, had softened into an expression of profound contentment. He appeared utterly at peace, a silent sentinel, having completed his vigil. A warmth spread through McGregor, chasing away the last vestiges of the night's chill. It wasn't merely the sun's rising heat, but something deeper, a quiet awe. Barnaby hadn't just alerted him, he had remained. He'd witnessed the struggle, grasped the peril, and stayed steadfast until the danger passed. Even then, he hadn't abandoned his post. He was a guardian, a protector, a silent promise to the vulnerable. McGregor took a step closer, mindful not to disrupt the serene tableau. The calf shifted slightly in its slumber, emitting a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. Barnaby's ear twitched, a tiny automatic response, yet he didn't stir. McGregor knelt, a rare smile creasing his weathered face. He reached out a hand, hesitated, then gently stroked Barnaby's thick fur. The dog's tail gave a single sleepy thump against the straw, a silent acknowledgement without waking. "Good boy, Barnaby," McGregor whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "My very good boy." He watched them for a long moment, the enormous cow, the tiny calf, and the faithful dog, a living testament to devotion. The barn, which hours before had felt like a place of dread, now hummed with a quiet joy. The air still carried the faint scent of birth, of hay, and a musky, comforting animal warmth. McGregor knew a mountain of chores awaited him, milking, mucking out, mending the north pasture fence, but for now he allowed himself this small, precious moment of stillness. He reflected on his initial irritation, his dismissal of Barnaby's frantic barks. How foolish he had been, how blind. Barnaby hadn't been a nuisance, he had been a lifeline. He hadn't been stubborn, he had been resolute. He remembered the dog's frantic nudges, his insistent whining, the way he'd led him back to the barn again and again. It wasn't just instinct, it was intelligence, loyalty, and an almost human understanding of distress. Barnaby had known, had felt the urgency when McGregor had been too preoccupied, too quick to assume. As the sun climbed higher, casting long golden shafts through the barn doors, McGregor finally stood. Chores awaited, yes, but something fundamental had shifted. His farm wasn't merely a collection of animals and land, it was a living, breathing ecosystem. And at its heart was a dog, who was more than just a working animal. He was family. He was a hero. He quietly moved towards the milking parlour, leaving Barnaby to his well-deserved rest. He'd fetch warm water and a fresh blanket for the calf, ensure the mother had plenty of feed. The world outside the barn was waking up, but inside, a new chapter had begun. One where a sheepdog's quiet vigilance had saved a life, and in doing so had opened his farmer's eyes. The hero was on watch, and the farm was safe.